The Silicon Queen. I walk to the beach and scan the horizon. No sign of a sail yet, but it is only just dawn. I don't expect to see a sail, but I check anyway. I do not linger. The day stretches before me, and I must prepare. When the Queen and her entourage arrive, all provision for their comfort must be complete, and there is no one here but me to accomplish this. The food for the humans is as prepared as it can be. Their bedding is clean and ready. The Queen, however, has her own requirements. Today I will pass the tedious hours making beautiful things for her. I scoop sand into a bucket and return to my work. I am the glassblower. I turn silicon into beauty. I am not the only glassblower on this planet, but I alone have the gift of breathing life into the Silicon Queens who preside over our affairs. The old Queen is coming to her final rest. Today she will feed on iridescent confections of glass. Her last moments will be bathed in beauty. I have spent the last year creating a serene glass garden. Today, while I wait, I will finish the final elements for her enjoyment. The sun rises. I pull a lump of molten glass from the furnace and shape a flower. Then I spin a spherical web to hang from a branch of the garden's central tree. When it spins, it will cast rainbows everywhere. I consider making some birds, but they seem trite. Instead, I pull long, simple fronds of grass, forming a depression at one end and laying a small glass ball into the bowl. When I press them into the ground in a row, they stand like simple hands, offering jewels to the Queen. By afternoon, my fancy is exhausted. The garden is finished. I hope it will delight her. The final thing to prepare is myself, and the best place to do that will be the beach. Tiny waves curl upon the shore, whispering an incantation that prepares my mind for the day ahead. Once more, I scan the horizon. There! A square black patch with the curve of a prow beneath. They're making good time. I sit cross-legged on the beach, shifting to make an indentation for myself. I scoop some sand into my hands and lose myself in memories. Aeons ago, my ancestor arrived on this planet bearing the instructions for two forms of life, one carbon and one silicon. Once it arrived on this planet, it was to assess the environment and determine whether carbon or silicon life would best survive. It was to create 7 hosts, then imprint them with the consciousness of 7 beings. No life form could survive the long years of travel through space. The old ones had tried and failed. Finally, they devised a way to preserve an incorporeal consciousness that could be transferred to a new life form. By that means, the culture and knowledge of the old ones would be preserved in the galaxy without the problematic necessity of transporting life forms that, even if they did survive, would, in all probability, just disrupt the ecosystem of their new home. I do not know if it was the old ones' intention to create both carbon and silicon life in one place, but on this planet, the intelligence that designed the hosts created some of each kind. The carbon hosts proved strong and thrived. The old ones had been carbon themselves, and so they understood the design. The silicon hosts were a theoretical construct for the old ones. Problems arose for which they had not accounted. My ancestor experimented, though, and one of the hosts survived. The old ones had sent the consciousness of 7 different neural nets that exemplified different states of being they considered necessary to sustain a population. A leader, a nurturer, a thinker, a warrior, an organizer, and a builder. Believing that the silicon host might prove too fragile to endure, the ancestor gave it the 7th consciousness, which it believed least necessary for the continuance of life, the interpreter. The silicon host gained its energy from light. Without light, it became brittle, vulnerable, and all its thought processes ceased. Yet, with adequate light, the being thrived, living longer than the carbons. It could live so long, in fact, that the carbons feared that by the length of its life and the breadth of its knowledge, the silicon being would dominate them. They feared it, and demanded that it put an end to itself. It agreed, on the understanding that some portion of its consciousness be passed to another being like itself. The ancestor had struggled with the design of the silicon being. It created something that could sustain consciousness but not reproduce, at least not in the manner of the carbons. If some portion of the old silicon being was to animate the next one, a means of transferring consciousness would have to be devised. The ancestor discovered that if a few shards of the old being were incorporated into the new one, then the memories of the old one would be embedded into the new without overwhelming the autonomy of the new consciousness. And so the ancestor created this beach, a repository of the pure silicon necessary to support life, enough for countless ages of silicon beings. Every 100 years, I add to the beach when I scatter the shards of the last queen upon it. In my hands, blended in the raw silicon which still forms the majority of the beach, I see the colors of queens past. I sift through the sand, remembering the face and reign of each one. I have been witness to them all. I alone remember their names. Not all the ancestral queens will become incorporated into this new queen. Fate will decide her memories and shape her being. Even she who must facilitate understanding between the people and maintain the peace cannot know all there is to know of our history. Her imperfect memory forces her to seek new knowledge, new ways of understanding. My reverie ended when the prow of the boat banged against the boat dock. I stood and acknowledged the lookout with a wave of the hand. 2 young sailors swung over the side of the boat and tied it into its berth. A gangway dropped into place and the Queen's entourage began to disembark. In the center of the ship, I could just see the lip of the Queen's golden bowl where she had lain in her liquid state, absorbing the energy of the sun during the 3-day journey from her island to mine. Her people arrayed themselves, waiting to assist her off the boat. Her fluid self flowed down the chute from the bowl to the platform where she could form herself. When last I saw her, she was dark and opaque, absorbing light hungrily. For the first year of her life, she had taken human form only 1 day out of 10, soaking up energy in her liquid form, learning who she was, communing with the memories of past queens gifted to her by her own creation. It had taken her 5 years to determine her own meaning and purpose, more than most Silicon queens. In the interim, her regent, the old queen's chancellor, governed in her stead. Her present chancellor, a middle-aged woman, who I only recognize because of her circlet, waits beside the platform. As Renyex assumes her human shape, she shocks and enthralls me. Every other queen has been a blend of 2 colors that swirl through her matrix. The colors are not decorative. They represent the opposite charges of her iridoplasts, the tiny units that afford her energy. They are the foundation of her physical life and her character. Renyex is opalescent. She has all colors swirling within her. I have no idea how this happened, or what it has meant for the humans who she guides. I have not communicated with Renyex or the humans since the day they sailed away 100 years ago. The glassblower has no role in the daily affairs of this planet. I am active for 1 year out of 100, and in that year, I create all manner of beautiful things, ending with the new queen. When she leaves, I resume my rest. I look more closely at her entourage, which differs considerably from any other I have known. There is no uniformity here. Each member is clothed distinctively. Some are unadorned, others wear jewels, and others are painted or marked. All colors appear in their livery. I can see no unifying theme or plan. I wonder if I have made enough food and beds. Her entourage is larger than most. This is hopeful. A large entourage means a wealthy society. Whatever their experience with Renyex may have been, it does not seem to have been a century of deprivation. I stand. The sand of queens past and queens yet to be spills from my hands. I step down to the end of the quay, the furthest I can go from the center of my island, and wait. The queen steps onto the beach first, followed by her chancellor. The 2 of them bend down and take a handful of sand. We form a triangle. The queen begins. "Greetings, glassblower. Are you rested?" "I am, Majesty. Thank you for asking." I bow to show my goodwill. "Allow me to introduce my chancellor, Gabella. She has served me well, and I anoint her regent of the next queen." "Greetings, glassblower," says Gabella. I bow again. I take a small glass bowl from a pouch by my side and offer it to them. They place their handfuls of sand into the bowl. "We rejoice in your creation," says Renyex. "I thank you for your confidence, Majesty." She acknowledges my bow, and then waves the members of her entourage forward. Each of these people contributes in some manner to the creation of her vision for the humans. Her vision creates the framework for their social order. I'm a bit dizzy at the complexity. In the past, whatever the nature of that order, it has always been binary. This society has been multifaceted. I am eager to hear the stories of your reign, Majesty. This time, I not only say the ceremonial words, I mean them. "There are many stories to tell," she says. I don't doubt the truth of this. I wonder rather how we will fit them all into a single evening. "Your garden is prepared." I bow again, and offer the queen my arm to lead her to her final resting place. Each queen must have her throne. For Renyex, I have molded an enormous trumpet flower, bending the lower petals to create a seat, while the rest of the petals form an arch around her head. Similar giant flowers appear to have tumbled down to the ground under their own weight, stems tangling around the garden, creating nooks and seats upon which the entourage can arrange themselves. Smaller flowers fill the foreground. Behind, graceful tree branches droop under the weight of jewel-colored fruit. In the center, a fountain dispenses water. I place platters of real fruit before the queen's servants to ease their hunger, but as custom dictates, they eat very little before the queen. They will fill themselves later. They take time to exclaim over the beauty of the garden. They wonder at the exact replicas of familiar plants. Everything sparkles in the afternoon sunlight. The queen says nothing for a time, but I can see her eager eyes darting around and taking in every detail. I believe she is pleased. "I believe you have outdone yourself, glassblower. None of my memories recalls a more fabulous creation. What inspired you?" As you know, Majesty, the original glass gardens were simple places where the queen could drain her energy and take her final form before returning to the beach and awaiting incorporation into the bodies of future queens. As time goes by, I gained mastery over the glass. I have enjoyed experimenting with different forms. I did not know if I would be able to create glass that would support the weight of such large structures. Every century I learn more about what I can and cannot create. I rejoice of what you have made, and all the others who share my being rejoice with me. If I may inquire, Majesty, the others who share your being appear to have remained distinct rather than subsuming into new identities. I have not seen this before. Yes, my being is different in nature from previous queens, said Renyex, quietly. Excuse me a moment? I bow and step back. My kind assistants, thank you for getting us safely to the island. So many days cramped together on a small boat makes for a weary journey. I release you to explore the island for the remainder of the day. Glassblower, have you seen to their needs? Again I bow, to the assistants this time. If you follow the path to the other side of the island, you will find food and drink laid out for you, also comfortable places to rest. The island is yours to explore if you wish for exercise. Nothing here will harm you. If you wish, you may go into the ocean to bathe. I do ask, though, that you stay close to the shore if you go into the water. Beyond the reef, I cannot guarantee your safety. Recognizing this as a command disguised as a request, everyone removed themselves, leaving the Glassblower and Renyex to talk. Glassblower, I know from the beings within me what was supposed to happen during the interim, what had happened to them during their reigns. I do not know why the many beings within me did not coalesce into two poles, but they did not. For the most part, the various parts of myself have coexisted peacefully, although there have been times of tension when competing ideas could not easily be reconciled. My reign has likewise been different in quality from those of the past. Rather than creating a coherent synthesis of two opposites, my society has been multifaceted. The Carbons found this confusing at first. Fortunately, my Chamberlain was a woman of large ideas who saw the potential benefits of diversity. The two generations that followed knew no differently, and so the society they built devised its own order, as they all do really. Now, when my being returns to the beach, I do not know how my diversity may impact subsequent generations, but you should know that the release from the constraints of a binary organizing principle has created changes in the very fabric of Carbon society. There are now people who question the necessity of returning to such a system. I assume that the next queen will be a binary being, as has always been in the past. It is possible some of the Carbons may resist this. I think you should know, because you are the oldest form of intelligence on this island, with the only continuous knowledge of our history. You may find yourself in uncharted territory. The Carbons may need more from you than they have in the past. I considered this in silence for a time. As you know, Majesty, I said, each of the intelligence forms on our world have their own limits. These limits exist in order to prevent any one form from dominating the others. I cannot leave this island, and my knowledge of the planet is limited to the information given to me by the Carbons and the Queens during the renewal ceremony. Yes, and my knowledge is limited to the memories of those past queens who are incorporated into my being, as well as my own experiences. The Carbons have records of their own, do they not? They have records, but they are limited. I do not fully understand why this was ordained for them. My information is partial. The Old Ones came from a culture that periodically destroyed itself, to the point of even almost destroying the planet that was their home. When they released the ancestor to this planet, our ancestor was only one of many sent to seed the galaxy. Each ancestor had the capacity to create life on the new planet when they arrived, and then overlay 7 intelligences onto the life that they created. It was hoped that life would flourish in many places, but the Old Ones clearly wanted any new life to be protected from their self-destructive impulses. I have no way of knowing if any other ancestors managed to create life. Certainly, any life they created would be different than what flourished here, because the essential building blocks would be different. The Old Ones wanted to allow for the possibility of both carbon and silicon life, but they did not anticipate the possibility of both coexisting on a single planet. When the ancestor made the decision to create both, it created a problem of 2 competing life forms. In order to balance the competing needs of these 2 life forms, each one had its own strengths and limits. The limitation placed on the silicon life is that there will only be one being in any given generation, because the silicon beings have such power of memory and knowledge as well as a longer lifespan. If they could exist in any numbers, the Carbons feared they would be swiftly overcome. However, the Carbons, who more nearly resemble the Old Ones, knew that they could easily be the authors of their own destruction. In order to prevent this, the 2 life forms created a controlled cycle of destruction and renewal. With each generation of queens, Carbon society recreates itself, according to the guiding principle outlined by the new Silicon Queen. The original Silicon Queen was a philosopher priestess, who understood the history of the Old Ones. The original generation of silicon and carbon beings who had intact memories of their lives on the Old One's planet agreed that the creative and destructive qualities of the carbons must be contained, or another planet-wide catastrophe would result. Renyex nodded. At the end of each queen's reign, the carbons destroy most of their culture. They do not destroy themselves, but the beings that exist burn or ruin everything that has been created in the previous 100 years. Those who live may use their own memories to create new artifacts, as long as they do not contravene the vision of the new queen. By this means there is some transfer of memories from one generation to the next, but it is very imperfect. You are the 89th Queen, Majesty. We measure time in a way similar to that of the Old Ones. We monitor the passage of the planet past a fixed point in space. When 100 of these passages pass, it is time for the renewal process, as you undoubtedly know. This is a somewhat arbitrary decision on the part of the first 7 life forms. This number, 100, had significance for them. At the time of the renewal, some of the assistants transfer the accumulated knowledge and culture of the previous 100 years to my memory array. This process takes some time. The assistants who do this remain on the island when the new queen and her entourage leave. They remain on the island for the rest of their lives, ending their lives when their task is done. Because they sacrifice their lives for this purpose, and because it is helpful to have knowledge of the early years of their own queen's reign, the carbons who volunteer for this task are usually close to their natural death. I also have some knowledge of the Old One's culture. My memory array is very large, and I have the means to add to it if need be in the future. Would it be possible for a single person to absorb this knowledge? Possibly a silicon being could do this, but the time required to absorb this knowledge might exceed the 100-year span of one queen's life. I do not believe that one carbon life form could absorb this knowledge in its entirety because they simply do not live long enough lives. Renyex sat quietly for a moment. I did not know I was the 89th generation. I have often wondered why my being did not polarize. I wonder if the complexity of my matrix precluded the synthesis required to create 2 poles. I do not have 89 beings in me, of course, but I have counted 43 distinct beings within my consciousness. There may be others that are a part of me, but did not individuate because the others overwhelmed them. How long was your interim? 7 years. Extraordinarily long. Yes, it posed some difficulty for the Chamberlain. It was because of this that she allowed the carbons a much greater latitude for independent exploration during her regency. By the time I was approaching maturity, the carbons in my care had already begun to create a culture without my guidance. The culture they created was quite complex. Not knowing what my ultimate organizing principle would be, she allowed a multiplicity of viewpoints, which meant I would either have to impose my will on an existing culture or collaborate with what had been created. I wonder if this is a factor in why you did not polarize. Explain. Each queen polarizes, and the polarization creates 2 competing principles. The synthesis of these principles is what creates the culture for that queen's reign. The polarization is itself a synthesis of the many possible dimensions of the infant queen's matrix into 2 poles. The queen's polarization brings about the polarization of the carbons, but maybe the process can go the other way. Maybe the diversity of the carbons influenced your development, so you could not completely polarize. Renyex nodded. It is known that the Silicon Queen imposes an energetic influence on the carbons, altering their minds and bodies to conform to her vision. It's possible the reverse is true, only this is the first generation in which this possibility became apparent. Glassblower, carbon and silicon have coexisted for almost 9,000 years on this planet through a process of controlled destruction and renewal, said Renyex. We queens have carried within us sufficient knowledge of the past to guide the creation of a new culture every 100 years. But the carbons exist in a state of innocence, unaware of their own history beyond what their own queen chooses to reveal to them. The binary nature of our cultures has imposed a strict conformity which the humans did not choose to challenge. In this lifetime, both they and I have questioned the appropriateness of continuing in this way. It has allowed for 2 distinct life forms to coexist peacefully and creatively, Majesty. Only one of those life forms, my own, has any sense of the past. What might we together create if we did not have to redesign ourselves every 100 years? How might these life forms flourish if they could grow without limit? Majesty, there will always be limits. It is better, I believe, if those limits are controlled instead of catastrophic. I do not understand. Periodic destruction brings renewal. Controlled destruction prevents disastrous destruction. And the carbon's willingness to conform themselves to a single overriding vision beyond themselves brings them a uniformity of purpose that allows their better impulses to flourish. Interfering with this balance seems a questionable enterprise to me. Renyak sat quietly for a moment. Glassblower, she said, finally, I am not sure what will happen in the next queen's incarnation. If she is like me, she may not be able to impose her will on the carbons in the same manner as the past. I fear that if that should occur, that the carbons, lacking understanding of their own nature, may become uncontrollable. It may be I am an anomaly, and nothing like me will be created again for some time. However, if you continue to create queens in the manner you have, randomly incorporating whatever previous queens happen into the silicon matrix, it's possible there will simply be too many to polarize. Another reign without polarity will call into question the ability of the queens to continue imposing a uniting vision on the planet as a whole. The carbons may decide they choose to live without those limits, and discover through unfortunate happenstance the consequences of disunity. This is a risk not anticipated by the Ancient Ones, or the First Beings, admitted the Glassblower. We have left the carbons in innocence of the full potential of their beings, both positive and negative. They have no sense of who they have been, and so no understanding of the possibilities of what they might become. If the next queen does not polarize, I suggest we should acquaint them with themselves in order to protect them from themselves. By what means, Majesty? I ask you to share your knowledge of this planet's history, and as much as you know of the old ones, with some of our younger carbons. 5 have volunteered for this task. They also agree that if the next queen polarizes and a new culture can begin as it has in the past, that they will remain on this island, unknown to the rest of the planet. If the next queen does not polarize, and it becomes apparent that no unifying vision will guide the culture, they may contribute to the carbon's understanding and begin to devise a new way of creating order. During my reign, the level of diversity among the carbons made for a uniquely dynamic and creative culture, but it also created a level of self-awareness in the carbons that has not existed before to my knowledge. The willingness of the carbons to conform to a single vision has been impaired to a degree unknown to the beings within me. They are also aware of an independence that they did not experience in their own lifetimes, because they all polarized, but I did not. This is another possibility I bring to your attention. The queen ultimately subsumes all other beings into her own being. Her vision becomes uniform for herself, as well as the carbons. I did not have that. I know myself to be Renyek's, and Renyek's commands. But what if another queen incarnates and cannot achieve an independent identity? I considered the unprecedented idea of a queen without a single vision. Finally I said, Majesty, I comprehend what you are suggesting. I agree that this could be disastrous for both life forms. The Ancient One and the First Beings did not anticipate this. Silicon life was theoretical to them. They based their decisions on the incarnation of the First Queen and what she understood of herself and her own capacity. Her understanding remained unchallenged until now. It is uncharted territory for us all, but my incarnation made manifest the possibility of change and the necessity of responding to it. Agreed. Must you sleep, as you always have, for the duration of the next queen's reign? I must renew myself for some portion of her reign, but I could spend some time with the carbons who wish to examine the records of the races and offer them some guidance before re-entering my hibernation. Do you agree with my suggestion? It seems to me prudent that I remain conscious until we know for certain the nature of the next queen and what order she may impose on herself and the carbons. I question the wisdom of including the carbons in any decisions about the future of the life forms, though. Carbons lack the wisdom for such matters. Glassblower, I will be long gone if such decisions must be made, but I hold a different view of the carbons. I have lived with them for 100 years. I believe some, at least, capable of wisdom. And consider, if you will, that in the early days of our existence, the First Queen collaborated with the carbons to design our society. The First Beings had a fundamentally different understanding of what it was to be a carbon life form, because they carried the memories of their previous race. They themselves volunteered to erase the knowledge from their descendants in hope that the mistakes of the past would not repeat themselves, and they have not. It is only because of the unifying vision of each successive queen that that peaceful innocence could be maintained. Majesty, do you believe that it is because of the many previous queens incorporated into your matrix that you could not polarize? That is my theory, yes. What if I controlled the number of shards that went into each subsequent queen? That would perhaps resolve the problem, but it creates another, because the nature of each queen is unique in part because of the unique combination of shards and fresh silicon. If you begin to interfere with the random nature of the process, does that not also create a breach with the past? Yes. Glassblower, I may be wrong. My anomalous being may never again be repeated. This culture may simply be a variant of all the possible cultures. If that is the case, then both life forms may put this behind them and proceed as before. I must warn you, though, that there are carbons who do not relish the idea of submitting to a more uniform vision under the next queen. They have enjoyed a degree of freedom with me that they do not wish to relinquish. The innocence of the carbons is at an end. It is. You speak of diversity, but, at least in the brief time I saw them, the carbons who accompany you seem to have a high level of harmony. I have certainly seen conflict-based cultures that have been significantly more disharmonious. I have fortunately been able to achieve harmony among the carbons during my reign, but it has not always been easy, and there is no guarantee that this will be the way in the future if a similar situation arises. You alone know the far distant past of the old ones. I think you alone can guide the next queen's incarnation and the carbons who she rules. This is why I ask you to consider not hibernating immediately when the new queen sails away. To this I agree, Majesty. Did the first beings anticipate any of this? Asked Renyex. Majesty, they foresaw the possibility of conflict. Do you have a protocol? I do. Several, in fact. Do any of the protocols seem applicable at this time? I will not know until the next queen reaches maturity. Are you bound by the protocols? Majesty? Must you obey the instructions of the first beings, or do you have an independent judgment? I do not know. Oh. I have not been tested in this way, so I have no way of knowing. Until now, nothing has diverged from the original plan. I see. I will not know my capacity until it is tested. I think it only fair to tell this to the carbons. What of the next queen? I asked. The being responsible for the entire culture of the planet should be a party to any possible risks that that culture may face, and also any possible opportunities that may be available. The carbons of this generation will undoubtedly share their experiences of me with the next queen. Yes, this is so. The knowledge of our conversation and the experiences of my reign need to be transferred to the next queen by some means. Do you wish for me to include shards of yourself into the matrix of the next queen? I do not wish to interfere with the natural process. If my shards are part of her, then so be it. My chamberlain will be responsible for the next queen's care during the interim. I ask that you share this conversation with her, so that she may have full knowledge of my intention and yours. I think that will allow for the transfer of knowledge without tampering with the natural creation of the new queen's being. I agree, Majesty. I will do as you ask. I thank you for this garden, Glassblower. I rejoice that my final hours will be spent in such radiant beauty. The hollow bowl of the island's center holds the garden. A low ridge separates the bowl from the far side of the island, where the carbons take their rest while not in attendance on the queen. At the top of the ridge, I spy two of the carbons standing attentively. Renyex waves to them, and they begin down the path. They are among the youngest members of the party, and they walk swiftly down the gentle path, taking only a few moments to reach the queen. Several steps from us, they stop and genuflect, remaining in a kneeling position. Glassblower, I told you some of our young ones would like to remain on your island and begin to acquaint themselves with the knowledge you retain. Here are 2 of the 5, Leandra and Sawaiden. Stand, children, and pay your respects to the Glassblower. They bowed respectfully, touching their hands gracefully to their foreheads. Who is who? I asked. Both of them had long hair and slender builds. One had a head full of braids. The other had a kind of beaded tiara. The braids nodded and said, Leandra. The beads nodded and said, Sawaiden. In past incarnations of queens, the carbons have divided into some sort of dichotomy. The organizing principle varies. Sometimes it has to do with color or size. Sometimes it's more subtle. But the dichotomy creates the basis for the culture and its norms. I confess, I see no such dichotomy among this retinue. Can you explain to me how your culture is divided so I may better understand your organizing principle? Leandra looked at Sawaiden, who nodded at her. Renyex has spoken of this. The carbons of this generation seem to be fundamentally different from the carbons of previous generations. Explain. Our beings require 2 to reproduce. This has been true across the generations. The dichotomies that existed in the past all allowed for the transfer of genetic material between the 2 principles in order to create new life forms. Yes. During the interim of the queens, no reproduction occurs. When the queen takes her final form, the carbons from the previous incarnation become fertile, but their offspring conform to the vision of the new queen and are fundamentally different from their parents. Sometimes this process occurs seamlessly, sometimes it creates conflict between the generations. Do you know, Glassblower, how this occurs? How can the genetic material of one generation be so drastically different from the next generation? The genetic material is susceptible to manipulation. The manipulation can occur by a number of means. One means is the radiant energy of the Queen herself. The Queen's vision is not only something that she articulates, but something that she is, and her being influences the development of all life on the planet during her reign. I would guess that because Renyek's never fully polarized, that the dichotomy that would normally prevail did not fully take effect. Because she is diverse herself, you are likewise diverse. How do you exchange genetic material? Do you mate in pairs? Generally, but not always. Some of us have 3 or more parents. The genetic material seems to be able to incorporate the material of more than one parent, said Sawaden. What is the impact of this on the offspring? Sometimes the impact is negligible. Sometimes it seems to confer strength. Unfortunately, it can sometimes be devastating. So the diversity among you is not simply a matter of surface appearance, but is more elemental? We believe so. Renyex made a humming noise to draw our attention. Glassblower, this incarnation has revealed possibilities for the reproduction of the carbon species that have not been apparent until now. I have been able to communicate to some degree with my previous queens, in a way that they were never able to communicate with their previous queens past their infancy. So I have had partial access to the past, but our understanding is broken and imperfect. The Carbons and I have many questions, which we hope your expansive memory will answer. Evolution is the process by which a species changes. On this planet, evolution occurs with every new queen. However, in the far distant past, before our life forms came to this planet, the carbon forms that were your ancestors experienced change differently. They had one dichotomy, and they exchanged genetic information in one way only. Change did occur, but imperceptibly over long periods of time. The 4 of us remained quiet for a time, considering the information we had exchanged. Then Sawaden spoke. Could it be that during this evolution, we have found a new way of evolution? A new way of creating change? I had not anticipated such a possibility, but it seems that may be the case. The Glassblower and I were discussing my incarnation before you came. We are both at a loss why I did not polarize. It is possible this is an anomaly. The next queen may polarize, and life on this planet may return to the old pattern of dichotomous existence. What if we don't want that? Asked Leandra. I think we should allow nature to take its course, Leandra, said Sawaden. There has been much discussion of this point, Renyex said, turning to me. Some of the Carbons want to return to dichotomy. Others want whatever will happen to be accepted. And others, like Leandra, wish to find a way to perpetuate the present diversity. I believe it will ultimately strengthen us, Leandra said. Sawaden, what are your thoughts? Asked Renyex. The next queen will be created, and her being will shape life on this planet, as has been the way for all our existence. I believe we must accept whatever comes, but I confess, I do hope the next queen is as you are, Majesty. But is that only because this is the only way of being I know, or is it because the way of being your reign has introduced is intrinsically better? I'm at a loss, Majesty. Glassblower, thoughts? Asked Renyex. Each queen is created through a random process that incorporates virgin silicon with the shards of past queens, and through that process becomes an individual. Once created, her radiant energy, what we call her vision, creates the life of the planet in new ways that are somewhat unique for each generation. There is continuity as well, of course. The life that exists here can only be made with the elements that exist on this planet, and must conform to the physical demands that the planet imposes. For instance, there is a limit to how large or small the carbon life forms can be and retain their integrity as life forms. And all carbon life forms do have carbon as their most basic structural element. Likewise, the silicon queen is fundamentally silicon. But within the bounds imposed by the physical reality of the planet, a huge variety of potential life can exist, and has existed. The most critical element that has existed across all the generations until now has been the existence of some sort of dichotomy of some kind that not only created the culture of the generations, but also dictated the transfer of genetic information. The old ones and the ancient one did not anticipate any non-dichotomous life. Until you release your energy in the garden and transfer it into my memory, I cannot say more. After I have had time to absorb and analyze the information you give me, I will be able to possibly, hopefully, offer a more useful analysis. You do not remain sentient for the whole duration of any queen's reign, do you? Asked Leandra. No. I sleep for the majority of the queen's reign. I remain sentient long enough to analyze the old queen's reign, and then awaken a year before the present queen is due to arrive on the island. I then prepare her garden and the materials required to create the new queen. Must you sleep? asked Sawaden. I must rest and regenerate. However, I do believe I could remain awake for a longer time than I normally do. I agree with Renyex that it would be good for me to do so in this case. I am willing to assist you in the transfer of knowledge to you. I think in fact it is essential that I do so. The volume of knowledge and the capacity to analyze it is probably beyond the limitations of your brains and lifespan. Will you be able to make sense of the information for us? Asked Leandra. I can respond to questions. The nature of the information I give you will be shaped by the nature of the questions you give me.
We must be wise in our questions, then,
said Sawaden. Leandra nodded. You are not the only questioners? I asked.
We are not. 3 others wish to stay.
When will I meet them?
They are older. They required more rest than us. They will be here soon, I hope,
said Sawaden. I scanned the sky. The sun will set in a couple of hours. The transfer ceremony will begin soon. All the carbons need to be here. Can you return to their quarters and request their presence? We will attend to this, and we will try to get Fariel, Asariel, and Garmin here before the others, so you can meet them before the ceremony begins, said Leandra. Thank you, I said. They genuflected before Renyex and withdrew respectfully from her presence. They do not fear you, I noted. I did not wish it. That has not always been the way. No, but it is my way. How have you maintained order? They do not fear me, but they know that if they behave disrespectfully towards myself or another being, then I will impose a consequence upon them. I demand order and respect, and I have received it without the need to resort to some of the more draconian measures some of my ancestors felt necessary. The order I impose is for their well-being. Those times when order has broken down have not been happy, so they recognize the necessity of order and respect the rules that create it. I am intrigued, Majesty. Your reign has indeed been unique. I will examine your memories closely when they become available to me. I hope my memories are of use to you in the future. We both heard a noise in the distance and observed a party of people walking towards the garden. They seem refreshed, I said. We sat in silence, having exhausted any productive conversation we might have. The Carbons arrived and genuflected. They asked permission to wander the garden, which Renyex granted. Despite the presence of the Carbons, tranquility reigned. Renyex and I listened to the buzz of insects. A pair of birds began to call back and forth to each other. She moved herself slightly to better position herself to enjoy these sounds. I was struck by how fluidly she moved. By this point in a queen's existence, she is usually far more solidified, and movement has become difficult. Evening sunlight struck her surface, casting a rainbow glow about her. She enjoyed the beauty of the garden, and I enjoyed the beauty of her, carefully committing each moment to memory to reflect upon during the long years of my upcoming sleep. During this meditation, a disturbing thought entered my consciousness. The shards of a queen contain her essence, but every shard contains the 2 polarities of her being. Renyex had no such unifying polarity. When she shattered, how would the various elements of her being arrange themselves? The shards would have disparate identities. How could any single shard encapsulate the essence of Renyex? Unlike previous queens, Renyex might be lost to us forever. I could scatter her shards across the beach as I had always done before, but no single shard would contain her. I had a duty to spread the shards, as I had all other queens. Of course I would do this. But the purpose of the scattering was to allow for the queens to be incorporated into subsequent generations and never truly lost. This also I had to do, but I was at a loss of how to accomplish this by following the customary procedures. Leandra stepped up to me as I contemplated this conundrum. Glassblower, we are here, all of us. I looked up at the 5 faces before me. It seemed Leandra and Sawaden were the youngest. Age seemed to be the only organizing principle visible amongst this generation. Beside Leandra stood a gray-haired Carbon of medium height.
Garmin,
it said. It seemed to be the eldest.
Asariel,
said another, with a respectful touch to its forehead.
Fariel,
said the last. Each touched their foreheads respectfully. Each wore unique dress. All were of similar size and color. I had no idea what might confer rank or status. They did not seem to defer to each other. The only protocol among them seemed to be deep respect for Renyex and a willingness to show similar respect for me. How am I to address you? I asked. They looked at each other. Garmin spoke.
we address each other by our names. Her Majesty does likewise.
Are you the eldest? I asked Garmin.
I am.
Does this confer status on you? Your age?
It does.
Are the others required to obey you as a consequence? Garmin hesitated.
Are you seeking the organizing principle of our generation?
I am.
I was not alive at the beginning of Renyex's reign. None of us were. The Chamberlain is the eldest among us. She has the clearest memories because she had first-hand acquaintance with members of the previous generation. There are a few others of our generation who remained on the mainland who have this knowledge. I believe our generation has arranged itself far differently than those in the past. Without a clear dichotomy among us, the first of our generation struggled to find a way to organize ourselves. We experienced more conflict and turmoil than most generations, according to Renyex. She accessed the memories of her ancestresses, but they offered little guidance and in fact had some conflict among themselves.
Really? I did not know that could happen.
Can you describe to us the principle of how a queen gains her identity? Renyex herself is unclear about this, and we are curious to know more,
said Sawaden, stepping forward. During her infancy, the Virgin Queen, formed from raw silicon, develops an identity. The shards of the previous queens become incorporated into the new queen's matrix, and their memories become accessible to her. They merge with the new queen's identity, creating the adult queen, who is an amalgam of the Virgin Queen and the queens of the past. At least this is the information I have based on what I observed in the first generations, long ago. As time passed, it became clear that I must conserve and renew my strength, or I would not have the capacity to create new queens. So I retired to this island and have remained here for thousands of years. I would imagine that Renyex's identity formed in a somewhat different fashion, since she does not seem to have amalgamated with the other queens.
She communicates with them,
said a voice behind me. I turned. The Chamberlain bowed and joined the others. You have memories of her early days?
I do. There was much turmoil. Renyex and the old queens struggled to amalgamate, but they could not. The conflict became devastating to her, and to us as well. The radiant energy she gave off made reproduction impossible for us. The carbons began to weaken, and some died without reproducing. It became clear to all of us, not least of all Renyex, that some sort of order must prevail, but without polarization, order would have to come by some novel means. She did something I did not believe any queen had done before. She got back into the ship, sailed to some unknown spot on the ocean, and allowed herself to remain in her liquid form for a considerable time, absorbing the energy of the sun and conferring with the queens of the past. What transpired, nobody knows. The carbons recovered somewhat. Those who remained could not reproduce, but they could tend their gardens. They endeavored to renew the soil, air, and water that had become damaged by Renyex's energy. Without an organizing principle or a culture to build, they really did not know how else to occupy their time. It resulted in a surplus of food that was ultimately very beneficial. When Renyex returned, she had not polarized, but she had become prematurely transparent from all the energy she absorbed while at sea. We could see the multiplicity of colors within her. They had arranged themselves in a harmonious fashion, and Renyex's radiation had become beneficial instead of toxic. The carbons began to reproduce quickly, and the population returned to its customary level quite quickly. With so many young minds all at once, and those minds freed from the confinement of a polarity, the culture flourished. Of course, there was much opportunity for conflict, but having endured such searing conflict within herself, Renyex had learned, for her own survival, to achieve harmony amidst difference. She guided us, so that we might find our own organizing principles instead of imposing one upon us. We had not realized that carbons could do this. The queens of the past were surprised to observe this occurring. Some are doubtful that this can continue without carbons coming to grief. Some are curious about the eventual outcome. Some are hopeful that a new age may be upon us. A few are fearful that our participation in organizing the culture will diminish the necessity of the queens and their role in culture making.
Do you communicate directly with the queens of the past? I asked the Chamberlain.
I do not. Renyex alone can communicate with them.
A light glinted in my eye. I looked up and saw the sun sinking into the ocean. It is almost time. They looked at each other, and I could see some trouble among them. Leandra and Sawaden clasped hands. The time approaches, I said.
Do you require anything of us?
Asked the Chamberlain. I do not.
Are we to remain?
It is customary for carbons who serve the Queen to remain in the garden and observe her final moments to show their respect. However, it is not required.
Do you think any remain on the other side of the island?
Asked Fariel, speaking for the first time since he introduced himself.
It would be wise to check,
said the Chamberlain. Fariel stepped back, bowed to me, and walked quickly up the path to seek any laggards that might remain on the other side. The others suddenly genuflected. I turned around and found Renyex behind me. Majesty, I said, with the customary bow.
While you talked, I toured the garden with the rest of my retinue. We are ready to begin the ceremony. Can you please join us?
Renyex led the way back to her throne. Arrayed around it in a rather ragged semicircle sat or stood her retinue.
Where is Fariel?
She asked.
He has gone to the other side to check for stragglers,
said Leandra.
Ah, I wish he had asked. All are here save for him. I do not imagine he'll be long. Would you like me to fetch him? No. Let us sit a moment together and enjoy the garden. If he does not come soon, we will have to begin without him. Glassblower, she said, turning to me. We were struck by the intricacy of the tree limbs. They mimic almost perfectly the branches of an actual tree, but this is not a tree any of us recall seeing on the planet.
It is an imitation of a tree found on the origin planet, an apple tree. It was known as the Tree of Knowledge and had significance in the spiritual traditions of several cultures. It was, in point of fact, one of the first domesticated plants of the pinnacle species, who were the ancestors of all of you. This plant contributed significantly to the development of their civilizations and remained important to them until the time of mass extinction, which caused them to seek refuge on other planets.
How is it, Glassblower, that the only life forms that left the planet were the pinnacle species? Why did they not bring other creatures?
For several reasons, Majesty. Foremost among them, the Ancient One, my ancestor, could only hold so much information. The majority of its memory held the neural nets of 7 beings who were the first generation on this planet. In addition, the ancestor held the knowledge of how to create life forms that would sustain those neural nets without damaging the indigenous life of the planet. But the Old Ones knew that the new creatures the Ancient One created would have to be adapted to the needs of the new planet, rather than the other way around. They sent their sentience and the building blocks of life, the instructions to integrate that life into the new world, and a database of information encompassing the whole of their history, that any life that did thrive would have memory of where it came from, and some guidance as to what they might do to ensure their own survival.
This information exists, then?
Asked Garmin, startled into an unseemly interruption. Yes, I answered, overlooking the breach of protocol since it didn't seem to matter very much to Renyex.
Do you have access to this, Majesty?
He asked.
My knowledge is partial, Garmin. I assure you that anything I know of the Old Ones, the Ancient One, or the first generations I have shared with you. The oldest of my memory queens existed 4,800 years ago. According to the Glassblower, and I only just learned this myself, I am the 89th queen, and so life on this planet has existed for 8,900 years.
Asariel nudged Garmin and frowned at him. Majesty, Asariel said, this is very startling news to us. We hope you'll forgive Garmin's gracelessness. Garmin genuflected.
Of course. My reign has been a strange one, and it ends with further surprises.
So Aiden stepped forward.
Permission to speak, Majesty?
Renyex nodded.
I observed on the beach when we landed that the sand has many colored shards throughout it. Are the sands stirred in any way to ensure that older queens are incorporated into the new queen, Glassblower? I'm curious about the procedure for the creation of the next queen.
I do stir the sands and dig down for a portion of the sand to create the new queen. I recognize the importance of incorporating queens from the deep past.
Glassblower, perhaps in this next creation, it would be wise to dig very deeply, since knowledge of the past could be helpful to our people.
The process is supposed to be completely random, Majesty. I'm not allowed to seek any particular shard or layer.
Can you overcome your programming?
No.
Can any member of my retinue assist you?
No. Leandra coughed and bowed.
Majesty,
she said, and then added,
Glassblower,
with a nod to me.
It seems to me that knowledge of the deep past will be transferred to the 5 of us by the Glassblower, who has undertaken to organize the story of our past and present it to us in a manner we can comprehend and use. Perhaps it would be more efficient to ask the Glassblower to turn his attention to the first generations and the history of the old ones, since it seems we might access that information as well.
To what purpose do you wish to access this information? I asked.
If we can better divine the intentions of the first generations and the hazards that they overcame to ensure the success of sentient life on this planet, perhaps we can better understand how to shape our culture in the coming generations. Especially if, as we have speculated, polarization becomes increasingly difficult for the queens who must incorporate so many memory queens into their beings. It is my wish that this should happen, Glassblower, said Renyex. I fear that if succeeding queens face the difficulties I have, that the creation of a peaceful and orderly culture to foster the success of the Carbons will become impossible. You spoke of the old ones having difficulty sustaining their culture. Could similar difficulties affect us?
The Old Ones never determined a means of establishing harmonious relations among themselves, and their constant conflict ultimately destroyed them. The first generation knew of this difficulty, for they remembered the conflict and destruction they had fled. In all that they did, they sought the means to create a harmonious culture and to prevent the worst impulses of their sentience from prevailing. The manner of cultural transfer they devised, with the carbon and silicon cultures going through a predictable cycle of creation and destruction, is specifically laid out to prevent outbreaks of destructive chaos, and it has succeeded. There have been some warlike and destructive cultures from time to time, but they are rare, and they have not been sufficiently destructive to threaten the continued existence of life on this planet. However, I continued, the key element that has allowed this is the polarization of the queens. If that polarization ceases to be achievable, then the culture and life itself may be jeopardized.
I believe the Carbons have the right to do what they must to ensure their own survival,
said Renyex. This is consistent with the intentions of the Old Ones and the First Generation. However, knowledge has not always been a friend to Carbons. They have sometimes used it to destructive effect. Keeping the Carbons in a state of relative innocence was a key directive of the First Generation to me.
If the 5 that I have chosen remain secluded on this island with you, then they may begin the process of incorporating your knowledge into their own, but they cannot contaminate the larger culture. Depending on what happens with the next queen, they can remain isolated and unknown, or they can be available as guides to the next generation.
This does not violate the intentions of the First Generation, I agreed.
All here, please attend my words and carry them in your hearts. These 5 shall remain on the island with the intention of acquainting themselves with the knowledge of the deep past. You may ask them for guidance after the infancy of the first queen has ended. If she does not polarize and cannot create a harmonious vision, you have my permission to access the island before the end of her reign, and thereby equip yourselves with knowledge to divine a vision for yourselves.
One of the retinue raised a hand.
Yes, Posen?
Asked Renyex.
A vision independent of the next queen, Majesty.
I would hope that your knowledge might help the next queen if she is struggling with her own nature. However, you have the right to exist. If the next queen cannot polarize or achieve some other harmonious state, I believe you have the right to attempt an independent vision that will guide you into the future.
Myself and the Carbons remained still for a moment, stunned by this heresy, and from the queen herself. At last, Garmin coughed and said,
It is to be hoped that matters would resume their more normal course, and that the next queen would polarize without difficulty. Your reign has been largely peaceful, and those of us who lived under you benefited from your wisdom and generosity in dealing with an unprecedented situation. We are grateful, for matters could have been so much worse for all of us without your guiding vision. However, life on this planet evolved in a particular way, and that has ensured our continued survival. The continuation of that mode of life must be our fondest hope for the future.
Looking at the facial expressions of the others, I calculated that over 35% of them disagreed with Garmin. Although they said nothing, and only someone like myself, programmed to read minute changes in facial expression and interpret them, would be able to tell. They made no overt expression of dissent. Renyex nodded, but I wondered if her nod indicated agreement or simply acknowledgement of Garmin's words. The Queen's primary reason for existence, beside the establishment of an overarching vision for the society they govern, is to interpret the intentions of humans and facilitate harmonious communications between them in order to diminish the opportunity for conflict. They have, I know, an acute ability to understand carbon behavior and motivation. Assuredly, she knew as well as I did the fault lines in her retinue.
The glassblower will follow all necessary procedures in the manner dictated by custom to create my successor,
said Renyex.
I, however, must take my leave of you, and I would like to do so in an appropriate manner. Gather close, please, that I may have a final moment in the customary manner with each of you before the setting of the sun.
That said, Renyex immediately broke with custom by asking her retinue to stand instead of genuflect before her. One by one, she spoke with them, describing their service and expressing her gratitude. In addition, she expressed a hope for what they might do to contribute to the next queen's reign, helping to create a vision for how they might use the interim to help support the next queen. It quickly became apparent to me that Renyex did not expect the next queen to polarize, and she was trying, subtly, to guide her people so that they could help the next queen overcome the challenges that she had been forced to face alone. They had no way of knowing that queens do not normally supply such information to their retinue, although I did. I held my peace, hoping, as she did, that what she gave them now would help them in the future. The final rays of sunlight faded. Renyex sat upon her silicon throne. She began to glow. Her own being merged with the surface of the throne, light seeping slowly through the interconnected passages of glass until the entire garden glowed with the light she generated. I stepped to my place and touched the glass, absorbing the light and all the knowledge that it carried, transferring her memories to my own. For hours we remained immobile as she drained all her light and life into the garden. It flowed through me to the memory banks hidden deep below the island, until finally the light faded. Out of the darkness came an eruption of grief such as I had never heard. I shut down all my senses lest they be overwhelmed. I understand emotion. I can interpret it and determine how it is likely to influence carbon behavior. However, I do not share the carbon need to mourn. While they wailed, I took a preliminary survey of Renyex's memories and began to sort them into a meaningful chronology. Her reign had been unique in ways even she did not understand, and it challenged the orthodoxy of the first generation in ways I had not anticipated from her descriptions. By sunrise, I had incorporated her memories into my own. Now the algorithms would begin to seek patterns. I turned on my senses and contemplated the scene before me. The edge of the sun appeared on the horizon. The humans sat or lay in a variety of situations. Some seemed to sleep. Near Renyex, 9 sat on the ground in meditative attitudes. The 5 with whom I had conversed earlier, the chamberlain, and some others who were unknown to me. Looking at them, it struck me that each had dressed in a distinctly different manner, with no discernible pattern of rank or order. Their lack of evident organization made it challenging for me to communicate with them because I had no easy means of categorizing them. Yesterday I had been focused on Renyex. Today I experienced something that is hard to convey in words. I will call it confusion, because that is the carbon state most equivalent to my own. I cannot move forward in my communication with carbons without an organizing principle of some kind. Finally, I accepted the principle of known and unknown and proceeded with that as my foundation. I stepped behind the chamberlain who sat facing Renyex and said, "I must perform the final rite." Their bodies jerked and twisted around as I spoke. It occurred to me that I should have warned them of my approach. Carbons are not as acutely sensitive to their environment as myself.
Glassblower, you...
The chamberlain stood, stretching a bit to ease muscles cramped by long sitting. The others rose with varying degrees of grace. "You were engrossed in contemplation. I beg forgiveness for startling you. The dawn arrives, and I have one last action to perform before beginning the creation of the new queen. All are welcome to observe, but none are required. I am aware that your experience of this transition is different from mine. I will give you time to collect yourselves." The chamberlain bowed respectfully.
Do we assist you in any way, Glassblower?
"No. This rite is mine to perform and must be done by myself alone to prevent any tampering with the process. You may observe, but observe only, and at a slight distance to protect yourselves." Leandra and Sawaiden, who seemed to be the youngest of the group, began to gently rouse those who slept. Several, it seemed, had not slept but fallen into a kind of stupor that could not easily be wakened. Since no urgency attached to this portion of the process, I waited for them to regain their composure in their own ways. The sun had risen fully when Leandra returned to me and asked,
What happens now?
"I smash Renyex into tiny shards and distribute all that I can collect onto the surface of the beach. I then stir the beach to incorporate her fully into the sands and collect the quantity of sand I need for the next queen. Renyex may or may not be incorporated into the next queen."
I see.
Leandra looked at the body of the queen, frozen in its final attitude on the throne. She reflected the sunlight from her opalescent body, but no light emerged from her. All the light of her being had drained into me or radiated out from the garden.
She is still beautiful,
said Leandra quietly.
but different somehow.
She radiated her own light before. Now she only reflects.
No, that's not it. Come closer, Glassblower. She has changed.
We stepped closer. Leandra had very sharp eyesight for a carbon. She had perceived something I had not yet discerned. The random opalescence of Renyex's matrix had changed during the transfer. The various colors of her being had not merged, but they had clustered together into tightly bound units. "Did this ever happen while she lived?" I asked.
Not to my knowledge. Please, can you wait a moment? I want to get the chamberlain.
Leandra waited for me to nod assent, and then moved quickly across the garden to head to the trail where the chamberlain stood, comforting some of the carbons. I watched as Leandra waited respectfully for the chamberlain's attention, and then waved her arms towards Renyex, speaking with suppressed excitement. The chamberlain's eyebrows rose. Together they returned to Renyex and looked closely at her. "Did you ever have the opportunity to stand this close to Renyex before?" I asked.
No, I have not. We must keep our distance because of the radiation she emits. However, I believe Leandra is correct. This organized configuration of colors is not something I recall seeing in the past. It seemed to me, from the conversations we had in the past,
continued the chamberlain,
that she could not organize the colors of her matrix, but she is clearly organized now. Is this what polarization would look like?
"No. In polarization only 2 colors remain. All others are absorbed into the dominant colors, and the memories those colors represent become part of the queen, but are not consciously accessible to her."
Renyex could always communicate with her memories. She knew them as individuals,
said the chamberlain. "I have surveyed and organized her memories this past night. Renyex's relationship with her memory queens was unique. I now have total access to everything she knew, but I will need time to make the memories useful or meaningful. The algorithms are working now. I will know more when they are done. Until I have useful information, I choose to remain silent. In the early days when I speculated to Carbons about things, the results were disastrous.
The
Chamberlain smiled.
We seem to have been a rather disastrous lot generally.
Your management has posed some challenges, but the old ones wanted to perpetuate sentience. Maintaining this objective is my reason for existence. I am charged with doing whatever is required to protect your continued existence.
Are you likewise charged with the protection of silicon life forms?
Yes, although they have proved less troublesome. Perhaps because there is only ever one at a time. It is difficult to have conflict with oneself.
I would argue that,
said the Chamberlain. I'm sorry?
Never mind. It's not important now. Suffice to say, she is now organized after her own fashion.
Yes. This does not alter the next step of the rite, but it does answer a question I had earlier. It will be possible for some shards to contain all of Renyek's if they are large enough to hold all her colors. At least some of the shards should be big enough. Therefore, her being is not lost to future generations. Sooner or later, she will be incorporated into another queen.
Oh, that is a relief,
said Leandra.
We also had concluded, as you had, that if her matrix remained disorganized, it would be impossible for the true Renyeks to be incorporated into future queens, which made our loss all the more terrible. Chamberlain, may I share with everyone the news that Renyeks may yet live?
Hold on a moment. Let us see how her matrix shatters. I do not wish to raise false hope.
I wonder if she knew this would happen,
asked the Chamberlain. I will know as soon as the algorithms cease. Then I will be able to share her memories and consciousness with you. It's possible some questions you had that she could not answer, or chose not to answer, may be revealed to you at that time.
Do you normally share such information with Carbons?
Asked Leandra. If the Carbons wish to reflect on their queen's reign, they have the opportunity to ask me questions before they leave the island with the new queen. However, most Carbons do not have many questions to ask. It seems to me that for someone as translucent as she was, Renyek's was remarkably opaque.
Indeed, it seems that is the case,
agreed the Chamberlain.
Leandra, I would like the 5 to remain for the rite. The others may go or stay as they wish. Do not speak of this. The glassblower is correct. We must not raise false hopes. Where would you like us situated?
The Chamberlain asked me after Leandra had left. The shatter zone is generally the edge of the garden, although the bulk of the shards will fall in place around the throne. These are the ones I will carry to the beach. I have tools for this purpose, which I must retrieve. I will be but a moment. Array yourselves before I return. The 5 and a few others remained while I returned. The others found the prospect of finding their queen shattered too devastating to contemplate. I set down my tools, baskets, a broom, a linen sheet, a hammer, and a metal scoop. Then I took the heavy rod of heat-proof metal, the same with which I would soon stir the new queen's matrix, and stood a moment, contemplating Renyek's beauty. The opalescent quality of her matrix gave her a luster that queens did not customarily have at this stage. A sob behind me recalled me to my duties. I lifted the steel and swung it down with a firm, sharp blow upon Renyek's head. The sound of her solidified matrix shattering rang out across the garden. Large shards tumbled to the foot of the throne. Smaller ones flew a further distance. With the broom I brought the mass together again in a heap. With the linen sheet I covered the shards to confine them. Then I used the hammer to beat down on the hole. I stopped, at last, when the hammer had nothing left to smash. Gently I lifted the corner of the sheet back, using the broom to gently brush shards from the fabric. I ran my fingers through the sand and shards that remained, wondering at its quality. I took one of the larger shards and held it up to the light. It contained every color, every queen memory that Renyek's had carried within her. I wondered if some of the smaller shards were composed likewise. It appeared that they were. Garmin came to kneel beside me, a lapse I decided to overlook. Clearly these Carbons were unschooled in the protocols of their kind. Renyek's lack of attention to this matter was the only fault in her that I could find thus far. Garmin took a larger shard and held it in his palm. He held it up to the light, then turned to show it to Leandra, who had come to stand behind him.
She is with us yet,
he said. She sobbed and nodded.
Glassblower, may we keep a shard for ourselves?
No. All must be distributed on the beach. If you keep any part of her, it reduces the possible chances for her to be reborn in a subsequent queen.
Can we help you?
Asked Garmin. No. The responsibility is mine. I will take that. He hesitated, but finally dropped the shard into my waiting hand. I had never seen Carbons behave thus. I confess it unnerved me a little. I took a moment to settle myself, then began the process of sweeping the sand and shards into the basket to carry them down to the beach and stir them with the steel rod into the waiting sand. With the same rod, I churned the sands to ensure they were well mixed. I took the time to dig deeply, If the oldest of Renyex's memory queens was only 4,000 years old, I clearly had not been mixing the sands as well as I should have. I stirred, watching for colors I remembered from long ago. I did not meddle, though. I did not choose any particular color or sift for this or that particular queen. I churned the sands democratically, then filled the baskets and carried them to the cauldron at the top of the hill, where the heat of the sun and energy I applied would cause the sands to liquefy. The carbons watched carefully from a respectful distance, cautious of me but also of the cauldron from whence fiery heat radiated. They stood at the gate and watched me stir the sands with the steel rod. It will take all of this day for the sands to melt. Tomorrow, I will test the matrix and add the correct quantity of acids and bases to allow for the matrix to gain sentience and adopt a form. From there, I have no role. I just attend the matrix until it solidifies into the new queen's initial form. I stepped away from the cauldron, leaning the steel rod against a tree to allow it to cool.
What now?
Asked Asariel. Time, I answered, perhaps a bit too cryptically. While the sands melt in the cauldron, I will review Renyex's memories. From time to time, I will return to the cauldron and stir the matrix.
How much time?
Asked Sawaden. It varies, between 3 and 5 days. It depends on the ratio of virgin sand to shards of memory queens. The more shards, the faster the process.
You seem to be stirring the sands on the beach quite vigorously,
commented Leandra. I made an effort to ensure that the sands are well stirred. It is important that the old queens be brought forward.
Will you share with us your knowledge of Renyex's memories?
Asked Garmin. When the others have left.
What are we to do with ourselves?
Asked Sawaden. I suggest that you join the others. It is customary for carbons to spend time with one another at this time. You may pass the time in any way that seems useful or comforting to you. When the new queen forms, I will call you to bear witness. I waited for them to disperse so that I might close the gate leading to the cauldron. The high, smooth fence would prevent the carbons from entering. The cauldron garden would remain sacrosanct until I opened the gate to allow the carbons to witness the queen's resolve into her initial form. 5 days passed. During that time I reviewed, categorized, and cross-referenced Renyex's memories. Each day I walked to the cauldron to check on the condition of the matrix. I added the acids and bases necessary to life on the second day. Each day I observed one of the 5, watching the gate from a distance. None of them approached me. I evaluated the condition of the matrix and returned to my work. By the 5th day, I was becoming concerned. Normally, a queen at least begins the process of resolution by the 3rd day. 4 days is quite normal. I reviewed my memories and can find no recollection of a 5-day resolution. The rather unnerving prospect of having to dispose of the matrix and begin the process anew presented itself to me. I carefully reviewed the protocols of the ancients and could find nothing to guide me. On the morning of the 5th day, I walked to the cauldron and tested the matrix. The chemicals appeared to be joining in the necessary ways to support life, only the process was taking an unwarrantedly long time. Rather than return to my work, which was largely finished anyway, I stood by the edge of the cauldron and watched the process. Thread-like strands slowly twisted through the matrix. I observed a thickening of the surface that accorded with past incarnations of queens, but a strange dent seemed to have formed that bisected the matrix. Slowing down my own processing to better observe the movements within the matrix, I observed the strands had divided into 2 groups. The bisection seemed to be not just a surface anomaly, but something more essential to the matrix as a whole. No such bisection had ever occurred before. I considered the possibility of reinserting the steel bar to break down this strange bifurcation of the matrix, but decided against it. I am to guide the process, but never to interfere, lest the integrity of the queen be damaged. I began to review my memories and see if the ancient ones had anticipated such an anomaly. They had not. I broadened my search and came across a characteristic of carbon reproduction that I thought might pertain. Confounded, I walked to the gate to peer out and see what carbon might be sitting watch. Fariel. I waved to him. Fariel, speak to me of the phenomena you know as twins.
Twins, glassblower. Twins occur when 2 young gestate together. It's rare. Our kind does not normally bear twins, at least not in the experience of this generation. Perhaps in other generations this might be the norm, I suppose. May I ask why you ask?
The matrix is forming in a manner I have not seen before. The matrix has bifurcated.
This is sometimes the way of it for twins. The genetic material separates somehow, and each twin resembles the other. In other cases, 2 young are conceived. They grow together but do not resemble each other.
This is a strange phenomenon.
It is unusual, yes.
Does the process pose any danger to the young?
I do not think so. If anything, the process poses danger to the carrier, who must find the resources to sustain two young instead of one. Sometimes one twin is considerably smaller than the other and struggles to survive. Other times the twins are equal in size and weight and both thrive, or fail, if such is their fate.
When one twin is identical to the other, are they beings of one flesh?
How do you mean, glassblower?
Are they one being in two bodies? Could one body be disposed of without harm?
No, the two are separate. They may resemble each other in character as well as appearance. Other times the two may look alike yet conduct themselves very differently from each other, but they are separate from each other.
So destruction of one would not impact the other?
Well, no, I suppose not. However, it would be considered immoral to destroy one of the twins.
Why? Therial paused, taken aback by my question, I believe. Finally he said,
Each twin adds to the generation, just as separate siblings would. It would be wrong to dispose of one of them. The twin is not a replica of the first. They have their own identities and gifts.
So each must be permitted to live, I said.
Yes, that is our custom.
What if the existence of two violates an important principle of life on this planet? I asked myself quietly.
Excuse me, glassblower, is something troubling you?
I thank you for your information, Therial. This matrix resolution is taking longer than usual, but I believe will be completed soon. I suggest you return to the others and warn them that they may be needed soon. Therial nodded and ran off down the path. I considered my next step. I could return to my memory processing. Renyex's memories were complex. I could do more to make them accessible. I could begin the reconstruction of the garden. Normally I did not do this until the new queen and her retinue left the island, but given the turbulence introduced into every other aspect of this process, perhaps it would make no difference to anyone if I too acted unexpectedly. It bothered me, though, to even consider this possibility. The garden would remain until all other life had left the islands. I, at least, would remain constant. Amidst my ruminations, several carbons arrived, panting and sweating. I considered them with disapproval. Your behavior is unseemly, I scolded.
Glassblower, Variel has suggested a possible problem with the new queen.
Garmin asked breathlessly. Fariel's anxiety is premature. No problem has manifested, I said quellingly.
But twins?
I glared at him and turned to Leandra, who said,
Waiting is hard for us.
You lack discipline.
How is discipline customarily acquired?
She asked. A variety of methods. The type of discipline required here is called patience. It is acquired by repeated practice. It is possible to encourage the acquisition of patience by various practices, including meditation, breathwork, and labor.
We are familiar with breathwork and meditation.
Are you?
Yes, we have been practicing these on the other side. Some are practicing walking meditation, and others sitting meditation. How does labor teach patience, though? We are unfamiliar with this practice.
Some types of difficult or repetitive physical labor can teach patience.
I would think they rather teach endurance,
argued Leandra. I considered her. I had limited experience with argumentative carbons. I reviewed my possible options, then said, Endurance is a kind of patience.
Perhaps. Patience would help endurance, I suppose. However, is this type of labor what is needed now? We understood the queen to be almost resolved. We believed our patience had been rewarded.
The process is taking longer than usual, I said, relenting a bit to allow for the possibility that extraordinary patience had been required of them. I do not know how much longer it will continue. Perhaps I was premature in calling you to the cauldron.
Is it customary for carbons to remain outside the cauldron garden?
Asked Sawaden. Yes, until the queen is fully resolved and has taken her initial form. This is to prevent the possibility of carbon interference.
We've been practicing breathwork and meditation, but our nerves are worn nonetheless. Is it possible you could instruct us in the labor you refer to?
What labor could they do, I wondered, especially given that the queen might resolve at any moment. One possibility presented itself, and a practical one at that. Food gathering. This has taken longer than expected. Your supplies are becoming depleted. I have much food, but it must be gathered. Do you know how to do this?
We can, yes, but we do not recognize some of the foodstuffs you grow on this island. Can you teach us what's best to gather?
Asked Asariel. Certainly. With some instruction and a few baskets, the carbons began walking around the island looking for food. They trampled some of the plants, but nothing that would cause lasting damage, so I held my peace. If the queen, or possibly queens, did not resolve soon, I would teach them how to fish. I returned to the cauldron to consider its contents. Since my last visit, the matrix had clearly divided into two separate entities. The time had come for me to consider my options, but this would require deep recovery of long disused memories, and this would take time. If the Queen's resolved soon, I would be incapacitated. Outside the gate, I saw Leandra watching. She had volunteered to continue the watch while the others gathered food. "Leandra," I said, "come in here." She had no idea how unprecedented this was. No carbon had crossed this threshold, ever. But she had no history, and so could not know this. She stepped quickly but fearlessly to stand beside me, adjacent to the cauldron. She peeked inside.
"What is happening here?"
she asked. "The cauldron holds the matrix, the mix of organic chemicals that will resolve into the next queen. Do you see how the matrix is divided into separate swirls?"
"Yes. Is this why you believe the Queen may be twins?"
"Yes. This has never occurred before in all the history of life on this planet. I do not know why it's happening. I do not know what, if anything, I should do about it. I am programmed to follow the directives of the ancients. They anticipated everything that might happen on this planet, except this. They did not realize that the matrix, held together in a single cauldron, might divide into two beings. The intentions of the ancients were clear. There should be only one silicon life form at a time. They did not want me to make multiple queens, but they never anticipated the possibility that two might form from a single matrix. I must consider what to do, and that will require me to go examine the deep memory and see if I can divine the intention of the ancients."
"Will you have to destroy one of them?"
"You are insightful. I may have to, or possibly destroy both of them. It can be simply accomplished. I would disturb the chemical interactions by adding additional chemicals, and I would insert the steel rod into the matrix to shatter what has been made. However, the destruction of a queen is not something to undertake lightly."
"Can you destroy only one?"
"I do not know.
"How would you even decide which one to destroy?"
There would be no rational basis for destroying one over the other."
"So it would make more sense to destroy both and begin again?"
"I confess, Leandra, I am at a loss for what to do. I must fall into deep memory, and quickly, because the decision will be out of my hands if the Queen's resolve before I have examined the intentions of the ancients."
"How is this your decision to make?"
"Your meaning?"
"This decision will affect all carbon life and the future that we will have. Are we allowed to participate in this decision?"
Another unanticipated complication. Carbons have never participated actively in this process before. The Queen is created, she resolves and matures, then her vision creates the future for all carbons.
"Carbons have no say in how this will transpire, or in the circumstances of their future?"
They trust in the wisdom of the Queen.
"Are queens always wise?"
That is not a question I can answer. I have no basis for evaluation. The Queen creates the society, and the carbons conform to her wishes.
"Carbons are not allowed to have wishes of their own?"
They have not. In the very ancient past, before life on this planet, carbons vied with each other to create a vision for themselves. They caused great destruction. The ancient ones felt it best that the carbons conform to the vision of the Queen in order to preserve order. Order matters. It allows the continuation of life. Without order, life forms strive against each other. The quality of the order does not matter, only its existence.
"You fear disorder if there are two queens."
I paused for a moment's review. That is the ultimate concern of the ancient ones. I do not feel anxiety in the manner of a carbon. I am not carbon.
"Are you silicon?"
The being you see before you is an ambulatory extension of the life mind of this island. I am the memory of life on this planet. I archive all events as they are told to me by the Queens when they download their memories into me at the end of their lives. I am both silicon and carbon, but I experience life differently than either carbons or silicons. I, for instance, never leave the island. I am forbidden to do so.
"Your memories, are they only the memories of the queens?"
Yes.
"So you have no memories of the carbons except those that come to you through the queens?"
Correct.
"What if our understanding of events differs from the queens?"
I have no means of absorbing your memories, and since your lives are brief... Leandra, time is pressing. I believe you have philosophical questions that merit examination. The experience of carbon life during Renyex's reign has been significantly different than that of past carbons. However, I must consider the wishes of the ancients with regard to these queens." Leandra nodded.
"What do you wish of me?"
"If the queens resolve, I must know immediately, but my attention will be diverted from the present if I am in deep memory. Can you watch and alert me if they begin to resolve?"
"How will I do this?"
"I will be in the memory chamber. The entrance is adjacent to the garden. You will find a metal wall with a door. I will leave the door open. If you come in, you will follow a tunnel and find me in a chamber. The room will alert me to your presence. All you must do is enter." Leandra watched the matrix for a moment.
I will do this,
she said. I left her there alone and went to entwine with the memory chamber, hoping to find some answer to the conundrum before me. I sank into deep memory, reliving the lives of early queens and trying to deduce the intentions of the ancient ones. I was midway through the reign of the 11th queen, Rel, when the chamber alerted me to Leandra's presence. I emerged from memory to see her standing in the middle of the chamber, arms tightly by her side. How much time has passed?
A day,
said Leandra.
27 hours, 13 minutes, 45 seconds,
said the memory chamber. So long. Have they still not resolved?
They have resolved.
I will come at once.
No, wait.
Leandra held up her hand.
We have done something, and I want you to understand.
Explain.
They resolved last evening.
What? You were to come get me immediately.
No. I disobeyed you.
Why?
It did not seem right to me to destroy them just because they do not conform to the expectations of the Ancient Ones. I mean no disrespect, but it seems to me that these two queens might be a blessing to us. How can we say unless we let them live long enough to reveal themselves to us? Maybe we need two queens right now. Maybe Renyex could not polarize because it was just too much memory for one being. Or maybe it's time for we, the Carbons, to forge a different kind of existence. Maybe queens and Carbons can live differently with one another. Just because our ancestors could not live in peace with one another doesn't mean that we can't. It seems to me that you see this as a problem that must be solved, but I see it as an opportunity. I spoke to the others, and they agree with me. We want these queens to live, if they can. And we want to work with them to create a new world for all of us. And we are not going to let you harm either of them. We don't care what the ancients said about all this.
Leandra stopped. I do not know why. I stepped away from the wall of the memory chamber where I had entwined myself and stepped towards her. She stepped back. I stopped. Is this fear you are displaying?
Why?
I do not want you to fear me.
I do not know what you are going to do.
Nothing that will harm you. I am forbidden to harm Carbons unless they are attacking me. You are not attacking me.
I do not wish to.
Good. Neither do I wish to do you harm. I have been in deep memory processing much information. I have been unable to discern the intentions of the ancients, except that they would very likely have destroyed both of the queens and begun again. They very clearly did not want to have more than one queen at a time.
Why?
The ancients feared the power of the silicon life forms. They have the capacity to live for many more years than they are actually allowed to. The ancients feared that they would become a master race and enslave the Carbons. By putting a limit on the life of each queen, and on the number of queens that can exist, they sought to protect the Carbons, not to harm them.
I understand that.
Renyex was a wise queen. Not all queens have been so wise. Especially in the early days, they sometimes sought power beyond the limits of what the law allows. They sought to live beyond the number of days allotted to them. I had to intervene on more than one occasion to terminate the life of a queen.
Can you intervene again if the need arises?
In those early days, I could move around the planet at will. Now I am confined to this island. Each of us is limited, Leandra. The Carbons are limited by their physical weakness and short lifespan. The Silicon Queens are limited by their obedience to the laws of the ancients and by their inability to reproduce. I am limited by my confinement to this island. In that way, no one life form can dominate any other, and the planet remains in balance. That balance will be awry if two queens are allowed to live. This may well be disastrous for the planet.
What if it isn't?
Two queens will create conflict, Leandra. This is always the way. The only way to ensure peace is to have all beings conform to the vision of a single leader.
Why may the leader alone have a vision? Is that the cost of peace?
It is.
But you have said yourself that the queens were not always wise. Do they always lead Carbons in a way that the Carbons like or want?
They lead and the Carbons obey. This is the law. What Carbons want is peace. That comes from order. You have no idea the destruction that comes with disorder, Leandra. That knowledge has been repressed for all the generations of life on this planet. Life can only flourish if there is peace and order. It does not matter what the ordering principle is, only that there be one and that all conform to it.
We disagree, Glassblower. Renyex allowed us to create the order of our lives with her. She did not impose an order on us. It is possible for Carbons to have a hand in the creation of their own society, and we do not wish to give that up. Our first action in the new order is to allow the queens to live and to see what they become.
This is dangerous, Leandra. You are endangering all life on the planet.
We might make it better.
You are in all probability making it worse.
We are determined to see for ourselves.
I have tried to dissuade you.
You have. I reject your arguments. But, Glassblower, We do not wish to be in conflict with you. The 5 of us who were to stay wish to do so still, and we mean you no harm or disrespect. Only we will not allow you to harm the queens. Fate has brought us 2 queens, and we accept this. We embrace them.
It is contrary to the intentions of the ancients.
Yes.
I will not be able to protect you from any conflict that may arise.
No, we understand this.
I cannot make a new queen for 100 years. You must accept the reign of these 2 queens, or destroy one and live under the reign of the other.
I understand. I will tell the others.
May I see them? I must do tests to ascertain their health.
Do you always do this?
Yes.
What if the queen is not healthy?
Any flawed queen is destroyed and I begin again. This has happened 3 times.
I see. One of them might be flawed then.
It is possible, or they both might be, as a consequence of their gestation together. They originated from the same basic matrix. If one is flawed, then they probably both are.
I had not considered that. The factor that created them may cause them to be flawed.
Yes. In the past, all flawed queens have been destroyed. The risk of having a flawed queen reigning for 100 years seemed too great to the ancients. They were very clear on this point.
In what way would they be flawed?
There is a chemical balance that allows the queens to mature. They must have the capacity to produce energy. If they cannot produce their own energy efficiently, then they are flawed.
I see. Is this the only flaw?
It is the only one that is recognized as meriting destruction.
How do you determine this?
The chemical balance of the matrix. I will take a measure of their matrix into myself and analyze it.
Does this take long?
No. Minutes.
We will not allow you to destroy them.
If the queens cannot produce their own energy, they will starve to death, slowly. It would be more merciful to allow me to destroy them. And in any case, a new queen would have to be created, because if they are doomed, then another must be made, or you will have too many years pass without a queen. It would be disastrous.
Glassblower, perhaps it would make sense for you to come see them. I believe they are as they should be, and if that is the case, then this conversation becomes pointless. Follow me to the cauldron and meet them.
Agreed. I saw a crowd around the garden gate as we approached. All the carbons on the island had assembled to wait and watch. Several of them protested as I approached. Leandra held up a hand.
Allow us to pass, please. The glassblower intends no harm. Asariel, Sawaden, let us pass. The glassblower has a right to meet his creations.
We will not allow you to harm them,
Said Asariel.
We have taken the rod.
I stepped to the edge of the cauldron, ignoring Asariel. Ignoring all of them. Majesties, I said, bowing low before them. As with all newly resolved queens, these 2 were opaque and dark. They needed to absorb light in massive quantities for weeks in order to begin to achieve their true physical form. However, they had resolved to the point where they had recognizable faces and limbs they could control. Not surprisingly, they were considerably smaller than most queens. They were bigger than carbon children, but smaller than the carbons around them. Normally, a queen is substantially bigger than the carbons she governs.
Glassblower,
The queens said in unison. You know me? I asked.
Our memories tell us who you are. Our memories are confused, though.
Do you know if you share all memories equally? The queens paused for some time before asking.
We do not know. We do not yet know ourselves, let alone each other.
Yet you speak in unison,
Yes.
they said. Do you communicate with each other? I mean, non-verbally. Again, a long pause, then they said,
We are one, yet separate. Our memory queens do not understand this state. We do not understand this state. They wonder if you understand.
Majesties, the matrix divided into 2 during gestation in the cauldron. Tell the memory queens that this has never happened before. They are not to be alarmed. We will work together to understand this new state of being. I must test you to determine if you have the correct chemical balance to sustain yourselves.
What does the testing entail?
Asked Leandra at my elbow. I take a small sample of the matrix and process it to determine the chemical makeup, I answered quietly. Will you permit this?
It will make no difference. We wish the queens to live.
If the chemical balance will not sustain life, then a new queen must be made sooner rather than later.
That would mean 3 queens.
Potentially. Leandra called over Sawaden and Asariel. I could not see Fariel or Garmin. After a heated discussion, Leandra came back to me.
Do the test, and tell us the result, and the queens as well. Let us all know what the results are.
I bowed. Then I bowed to the queens and explained what I must do. They acknowledged me by reaching out their fledgling hands, from which I might take the necessary samples. I took a greater than usual length of time, not only testing their chemical composition, but the composition of the memory queens embedded in their matrices. The sun had almost set by the time I reactivated so as to be able to communicate with the carbons and the queens. It seems you have the minimum necessary chemical composition to sustain life. You are both capable of survival. You are composed of the same memory queens, however the balance is different in each of you. Consequently, the queens will manifest differently in both of you. You are not one being with two bodies, you are two separate beings. The Ancient Ones would have advised your destruction, I believe. It will jeopardize the peace of the planet to have two competing visions.
Did the Ancient Ones explicitly say this? Or are you extrapolating from available data?
Asked Asariel. I am extrapolating. I explained to them that the easiest way to destroy both queens would simply be to cut off the power to the cauldron, something I could easily do without ever moving. I am in constant contact with all manufactured elements of the island, including the queen's cauldron. However, I continued, I am extrapolating from very incomplete data. The margin of error is high. I cannot do something so drastic as to destroy the queens if the data is incomplete. I must allow them to live and determine from their actions whether they are a threat to the peace of the planet.
You will not interfere with them.
Not at this time.
Not ever,
said Asariel firmly. If they become a threat, I must act in order to save you. I must always act to save the carbons first. That is my programming.
We carbons can protect ourselves,
said Sawaden, somewhat belligerently.
Stop. Do not dispute with the glassblower if no dispute exists,
said Leandra.
We are in agreement for now. The queens shall live.
They shall live until they pose a danger to the islands. If that happens, I will act.
We understand,
said Leandra.
We also will act if either or both of them become a danger to us. But for now, they aren't a danger, and so they live.
All of us turned to the cauldron where the dark matrix of the two young queens shimmered in the afternoon sun. They were losing their form. The energy drain of resolving had exhausted them.
We must sleep,
they said. Already I heard a slight difference in the timbre of their voices. Yes, they were clearly distinct, however uniform they might appear to the untrained eye. I wondered how these differences would manifest in the days to come. However, for now, they dissolved into two swirling, entwined masses.
Rest, my queens,
said Leandra, stepping to the edge of the cauldron.
We will protect you both. Always.
You cannot say that. Someday you may have to choose one over the other, I said.
Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe there is room enough for all of us. Maybe two visions will result in a better world instead of a weaker one. Maybe we will have a vision of our own.
I considered this unexpected possibility, one for which I had not considered in the past. This is also possible, I suppose, I said.
Yes, glassblower. This is also possible,
said Leandra.